thank you so very much, and please go ahead with your awesome talk. Thank you.
Thank you.
Applause, man. Thank you.
So, welcome everyone. Today we're going to speak about the limitation or is an illusion with template exploitation. So, we jumped right into it. So, we're first going to cover some outlines, what we're going to discuss. So, a first introduction to who am I. We're going to speak about some template engine basics for those of you who might not be too familiar with it. We're also going to speak about how the research started and the workflow about it. We're going to go through some goals. And finally, the fun part where we're going through the exploitation. And you can see all the template engines here. And the question at the end, obviously, if it's time, I'll allow it. So, only one issue. I don't have time to speak about everything because this presentation will be about a lot of advanced payloads, which will take a bit of time to explain. So we will dig into the most interesting parts and different techniques that are used in different. So let's get started. So first, the introduction here. I'm a hacker, also known as the hacker Brumens. I work at YesWeHack as a research establishment analyst, and I'm a hacker, bug bounty hunter, and also a developer, mainly in Golang. So we can speak about some basic template engine usage. If you're not familiar with it, it's basically, if you'll look at the code below, you can see you had the template equals welcome, and you have some brackets where it's having a username. So the username inside is a variable. So the line under it, you can see it's having output equal to the template render. So it's username equal Brumens, which means that this will result welcome Brumens. So a template engine is used, for example, when you log into your account, and it will have dynamic content depending on the user. So what can go wrong here? Basically, you saw the last one where you had a parameter with the brackets. In this case, you have the same code, or it's not the same code, obviously, but it will result in the same result. So it will say welcome, and then it takes a request, a HTTP request, and it will have a user name parameter. And if you have your name inside this one, it will also output your username, if you write your username. However, there is one catch. As you can see, it's added to this string, and it's not a variable inside the string, which means that if you're actually importing a value in this username parameter with a variable of the template you saw before, as you can see, it will result in a template injection, which means that you can execute code. And that's what makes it vulnerable. So, to get started, for my research, I did some bug bounty hunting, and then I found an SSTI. That's cool. So, and then I spent a lot of time to try to exploit this vulnerability. However, it was super limited, which basically means that whatever I did was to try to execute code didn't work. So the best I could do was doing like some basic mathematics, so like 7 equals 2. So with this, my hope failed, and I reported a template injection with the impact being 49, which was super disappointed, because in most cases you can get RCE from this, but in this case I couldn't, at least back then. So right now, I set up a goal on how can I achieve an RCE in almost any cases where it's super limited, but I don't want to be having some kind of resource such as the HTTP headers. I don't want to have resources as parameters. I don't even want to be in need of strings. So the reason for this is because I set up some goals first, obviously. So the first goal was the payload should only work with built-in functions and methods that the library is using. So each template engine uses different functionalities for different template engines, which means I should limit myself to only this, nothing else. That was my first goal. The second goal, as I mentioned before, it should also not take HTTP parameters or headers, which means if it's rendering or executing inside a PDF document, for example, it should still work. Or if it's executing 1 week later, it should still work. The other thing is should also work in all scenarios, as I mentioned. The main goal is to receive an RCE, which is basically that you have full control over the system. So, this last goal, it should work from the most popular template engines. So in PHP, Java, Python, having their own ones. So for example, if you're familiar with Jinja, Twig, Mako, Groovy, FreeMarker, and a lot of others. So, we can start with Jinja. So Jinja, in a basic payload, and don't worry if it looks too advanced, I will explain it, but this is a super basic RCE payload, right? There is only one issue. You're having ID, as you can see the green one. It's basically making this in need of a string, which is one of my goals that I did not want. So, to explain this, you can see it's starting with self, which is basically itself. It's then using an attribute chaining to access the OS module, which is at the end, next to the popen. Then it's using the ID, which is green, which is meaning it's a string. So that's the command you're executing on the system. So what can I write for payload that is the same? So the only issue I have right now is the ID. It's a string. So there is one technique you can use, which is basically this. What you do here is might be advanced, but you're using add itself one more time, and then you go to the globals. So this is Python. So Python basically have a string with global methods, and this will, in the orange field, will make everything into a large text. When it's in a text, I will take the index of 51. And in this case, it's the I, so it's an I character. And then I will plus this one, or add it, with another one, which is 34. And this is the D. It might depend on your payload or a specific case, but this method works. So it will result in ID. How can we use this, or how can we prove it? Like, for example, here, in this playground, it's from Dojo on YesWeHack. You can actually just write the payload, as you can see, and I add it to the output field, and you can see on the right, it's outputting ID. So I know it works. So now the only thing we need to do is to include this part in the payload. So to do it, you can see now we're in the middle line. It's the same one that I showed you before with the ID. So only this line is giving you the ID word, basically. And the other payload is basically the exact same as the first one, because it wasn't in need of any change. Cool. So as you can see, we crafted the ID, and we used popen, which is executing our command. So, and we can see here we got an RCE. So this one works fine. Cool. Now that we're done with Jinja, let's move over to Twig. And this is my favorite one, and it took me a couple of days to figure out how to exploit. So, Twig. This one is in PHP, and it's also known to be one of the hardest ones to exploit. So compared to Python, which is quite simple, or simple in quotes, as you just saw, Twig is a lot more annoying. So this payload is looking super easy compared to Python, right? It's just ID, map, pass-through. That's everything. So basically here, the ID within a list, as you can see with the brackets, is then using a pipe to take this value inside map, or not inside map really. Map is calling pass-through, which is a method in Twig or in PHP, or in Twig actually, that will take the ID and execute it. So, how can we make this payload work? Well, this exact same payload is this payload. So, this is a bit more advanced, so we will jump step by step. So the first row you saw is this one. If you're familiar with the other payload, as I showed you, you can see it's including the ID and the pass-through, which was a string in the previous payload. Right here, we're having the zeros, which is just a splitter. So this one is just separating the values, so I have something to go for. It's also declaring in a block, which means this will be technically something that technically a variable, but it's including the text inside as a value. And we name this block to the variable named u, as you can see in the beginning. So the next thing we do is we're going to set a new variable called x. And this variable here will take block, which is a method in Twig, which will call the first line. And this is the smart part, because you remember the variable is u, right? So I cannot write the letters. That's the whole point. So the reason why this is u is because the blue character, which is charset, basically tells what kind of encoding it uses, which is by default UTF-8. And as you can see, it's a green line in between, which is a pipeline. It takes the first letter of this encoding, which will be U. So it's actually calling the block that we did in the first line. Then it takes splits on zeros, which is fine because it's not a string, it's not letters, which makes it possible to split the ID and the pass-through. So to combine all of this, we make the final execution, which looks similar to the first payload. So X is taking the first item of the list, which is ID. Then you will pass it to map, which you saw in the first payload. It will then take X last item, which in this case is pass-through. It then uses join, which is a common function in programming language that will combine it into a string. So your result will be a string. So to prove it, we have a playground here. So I just inserted the payload, and we got a full remote code execution. And we're done with Twig. And this took like 1 week to figure out. And trust me, it's not that easy if you limit it to all the functions. It's not. So let's go over to FreeMarker. So FreeMarker is a template engine that are used in Java. It's also quite limited if you're using only the function and method that is included. If you're using library, you might be screwed. But in this case, you're limited, and it's super hard to get out letters if you're not able to make strings directly. But I find one cool function which is used in loop functions. For example, if you're having a lot of alphabetic word lists in your website and you need to print, for example, the first 20 letters, instead of writing a long list, FreeMarker has an option for you, which is a method that is lower ABC and upper ABC. So it will take a letter or an integer. So the first one will be the first in the alphabetic, which will be an A. And I will show you here. So if we do A question mark lower ABC, it will take A, jump this or pass this value to a method which is lower ABC. So can you guess what it will be? Well, it will be an A. So we got our letter. So we will use this method now to actually create a string. And if you look at the payload here, or we can have one more example. I forgot this one. So this one is using 2 and pass it, and surprise, surprise, it will be a B. So now if we pass this, how can we use this method that we have created to actually create strings or build payloads? Well, turns out that everything is almost a string in Java FreeMarker, which means this method will be extremely useful because in this one, it's passing or calling the FreeMarker.template.utility.execute. So similar to the Python one you saw in the beginning, which was in white text, this is doing the exact same kind of. It's taking the execute method, which is used to execute system commands. It then used the question mark to take this method and make it to a new object. It then takes the ID at the end, and that will be our command to execute. So I come up with this. And yeah, you could make it a lot more easier. It probably will be a lot of code. I don't want to spend that time. So I made it simple. I did every letter and every letter. However, there is one thing here. You remember the dots within the string? Well, when you also remember the function lower ABC is only doing from A to Z. So we still have dots, so that's an issue, kind of. not really. I figured out one way you could do it. And as you saw in the payload, you see some weird stuff here, maybe in like the middle, where it's 1.1, question mark C, bracket 1. Basically, what I did was, instead of inserting a direct integer, I inserted a float, and I then take it and pass it to a variable called C, which is converted into a list. I take the first, or it's not technically the first because that will be 0. So it's the second item, which is the dots. So I use this method to create the dots. And you can use the same method, for example, if you want to execute other commands. Like we're using ID in this case as a proof of concept. But you can also use, for example, base64, or you can use some crazy encoding in the bash side that will still accept it, and you can still get a full remote code execution and reversal by using this kind of methods as well. I don't dig too much into it, but it's fully possible. So, as I mentioned, we'll use all the lower ABC here to build up our string, as you saw the first one, where we call execute. And then, finally, we use new, and you see the last two lower ABC is creating the ID. It's then passed to the execute class that was created before, and finally, we got a remote code execution. So to make this a bit easier, I wrote a Python script like this. It's quite simple. You just open your terminal and write the command you want, and it will provide you with it. So as a proof of concept, I smashed it. Sadly, as you might have seen, it was super long, so it's not fitting the screen. But you can see the proof of concept, and you get ID. So now FreeMarker is done, and we have this one ready to go. The last one we'll talk about is Groovy. So Groovy right here is a Java-based as well. And it's a lot similar to FreeMarker, but it's having some different methods and functions. For example, it does not have the lower ABC. However, it has another really cool methods that you will see soon. So the payload looks quite similar. It's using the ID and using the dots to pass it to the function execute. You can then do .text to have the full result in string. As mentioned here, so everything we need to do here is creating the ID, basically. But as you've seen before, it might not be as easy as it looks like in the first payload. So I come up with this. It's not super complicated compared to the previous one, but this one is basically using x equal new string, which will then create a new string. Basically, just an empty string. It will use a quote here. As mentioned here, it will take x and make it to an empty string. It's using the object, so this makes it possible to do it without a quote. So what I do then is I make a for loop and I make an array, because I can still use integers. So I take this and take 105 and 100, which is the ASCII values for I and D. I pass it into the array and I loop over it. And then you can see next, we're using x plus equal, which will then take the value, or the current value, which is first 105. It will use the blue function, which is char, which is converting this integer into an actual letter by using the ASCII value. So, and it's adding it to the empty string, which was x. So, after that, it will then take the D, and you finally have ID. And then I use the method toString, which is basically converting these values into a string. To be honest, I don't think you need it when I realized I just did string here. But to be safe, you can use it. And finally, we take the value that we created, which is x, and we pass it to execute. So the last part of the payload is actually similar to the one we just saw. So, as a proof of concept, we're having a remote code execution here. Quite cool, right? So, the Groovy here is done. And we're now fully able to exploit Twig, FreeMarker, and Groovy. And if you're more interested, you can obviously read the article. It's on YesWeHack, and you'll find it on my website as well, where all other template engines are included as well. So, we did it, boys. Mission accomplished. So here, you can see, for example, all the resources I used. You're having the blog here with the full article. You're having the Duo platform, which was used in the Jinja. You're also having my website if you want some payloads. It's also more payload than just the SSTI. And finally, a big shout out to HackManit, which provided the template injection playground. It saved me a ton of time, so I'm really grateful for that GitHub project, which I found like 1 month after the research, when I already done a couple of them, which was a bit annoying, but I managed to do it. So a big shout out to them for making this good playground. So I want to thank everyone. A big thank you for listening. So yeah, last, we have any question for us? We've got a couple of minutes left. So there is someone? Okay, to be honest, I can't see it from the light. I think I see some hands, but I'm not sure. Oh, yeah, sure.
Thank you.
Hi. In all those cases, the string wasn't escaped, right? Well, in the template, they weren't escaped.
It's a specific. Oh, yeah. You mean on the first slide? Yeah.
In all of them, you know, when you render a string or an input, you can escape it, so it doesn't execute.
What do you mean? Sorry.
At the developer side, when the input comes in, when your payload comes in, it wasn't escaped, right?
Yeah, when it's coming into the server, yeah, I get it.
You know, you can escape the string, so it's not read as code.
I quite not understand.
Te lo pregunto en español y cuando el código se escapa, cuando ingresa un payload, se escapa para que no sea leído como código, pero no sé en estos casos.
He means if you escape the code from the developer side, like quote or something, I guess, it is mitigated, or you can bypass like any other method. That's the question.
Oh yeah, you can bypass. That's the purpose of it. You can bypass a lot because it's bypassing basically everything. Like obviously, if it's executed in a PDF, you won't see the result of ID, for example. However, because it was just a proof of concept, so you can basically just do a reverse shell or out-of-band connection where you use curl, for example, to send a request. And you can, for example, use these payloads in general to bypass both firewalls, and it's extremely good. I noticed to bypass HTML escape, which is actually a method that is used a lot, which is used in, for example, XSX protection. And if it's used, like most of the time when a template engine is vulnerable, it's reflected within it before it's rendered, right? So in most cases, the developer might add HTML escape before. So this means that was also the goal. Because if you should use a quotation mark, it should be escaped, which will fail the full payload. So that's why we built without the quotes and used only the limited methods within the actual library or template engines. So this method, you can bypass, I will say, almost everything. Not everything, obviously, but a ton of stuff. Did that answer your question?
Amazing.
Perfect.
¿Alguna otra pregunta? Preguntas por acá.
Hi. Any mitigation that you suggest for these cases that use templates engines?
Yes. You should obviously never append values before something is rendered. I notice a lot of time this vulnerability occurs, not because you're like a dumb developer that execute render 2 times under each other, but because either the framework you use sneaked in a render method in a default function that you're not aware of, or that you actually created a custom function which is supposed to render a string, but
you accidentally did a render before or after, which means that you have two render functions, but it's in different places in the code, which makes it lost on the way and makes the server-side template injection go under the radar. So to fix this issue, you should, as a fail-safe, always use sanitize the user input, obviously. That will prevent a lot. But to mitigate the vulnerability itself, I will highly recommend to never, ever include render within a custom function, because that will eventually end up with a SSTI.
Thank you, Alex.
Yeah.
Another question here.
Hi. We can blindly guess about those payload. I mean, you say that we can bypass any protection with this using such methods, but in case they are escaped, as the other guy says, we can guess or blindly apply this methodology to see if there is any escaped applied to the sanitization of the input.
You mean if any other characters is escaped? Yeah, okay. Yeah. I see. Most of the time, if you look at the functions, like the sanitized functions for use inputs, like HTML escape, back in even now, it's only escaping based on HTML. So that's something we're not used. And that's also a big reason why I could not exploit Ruby. Because Ruby, or not Ruby in specific, but ERB, which is a standard or a very common library that is used for templating in Ruby, it's using the actual tag syntax, which is the same as HTML. And this fails all payloads nearly. However, the only real big issue would be if it's actually escaping the brackets, which is used to create the payload. If it's not escaping the brackets, you have an SSTI no matter what. However, that's bring back to the limitation. I told you in minor cases it can bypass, and that's probably, or it is true. It in some rare cases it might not be able to. But in that case, it's most often because it's some strict regex that is custom before this is executed.
Thank you, Alex. ¿Alguna otra pregunta más? Un Uber para hacer. ¿Quién iba primero?
Hi. In the case of FreeMarker, in which you had to use 1.1 question mark C and 1 to be able to generate a dot, were you also able to find a way to do, for example, colon, dash, and / as well? Because those characters can be useful in certain commands as well. Thank you.
That's correct. That's a really great question. Actually, no, to be honest, I did not. However, due to the bash or the actual shell that is used to execute it, it depends a lot, because in bash, you could, if you're having the / you're good to go like that. That's the only character that you ever will need, because it can create Unicode or hex or octal or basically anything. However, in most cases, you could execute nearly all command. For example, if you have curl, you can just do, or a tool that you can pipe to, you can use it to insert data. And for example, using curl, you can use the post requests that will send like a file content or a command content to your server. But no, to answer your question, I did not dig more into the specific character.
Thank you, Alex. Acá hay una más. Ahí va.
Hello. If you have to recommend, do a recommendation for people that there is no very involved in this kind of vulnerability, and you have to send like bullet points to what study understand in order of the topology, architecture, and things like that, what do you recommend to get involved in this kind of vulnerabilities?
If you want to get involved in looking for them?
Yeah, more deeper than.
Okay, more deeper. So template injection in most of cases occur due to either double rendering, which is, as I just mentioned, which is using double render functions. So to detect it, because it's using double render, its most common cases is actually second order. And if you're not familiar with second order exploitation and second order vulnerabilities, I can give you an example. It's, for example, if you use a database to store template files, or you store it in a folder, for example. But let's imagine you store it in a database, a SQL database. So you're having a string from a user, which is a comment. We say it's a blog website. The user is making a comment, and you provide a payload. The database will then store it in the database, and maybe on, for example, the admin side, it will then use it one more time and render it. So that means that the payload is included within the database already from the beginning on the comment. So it will not execute when you do the comment. But if you're, for example, the admin is viewing it and verifying the comments, or someone is trying to block it, or it's saving it in a banned account, for example, because it's including the payload within the actual database and will be extracted from the database, most times it will be included in a template file, because that's how it works in modern applications. And that could result in the template injection being executed somewhere else, which in this case will be on the admin side. So to test it, I will recommend to do out-of-band payloads. So you can use this payload as just provided, and you can, for example, do like a dig. So if you do like dig, and you do your IP address of your server, if you ever get a response back to it, it's maybe likely that SSTI has been executed somewhere. And then you have to figure out where it's executed. It's similar to blind XSS.
Thank you, Alex.
Yes, it's recommended. So he asked if it's recommended to hash it or modify it, and yes, it's recommended.
This was enlightening, man. So amazing talk. Huge applause for Alex.